Let's walk the talk.
This is Clement Manyathela
on 702.
So we continue with our focus on the big developing story this morning around the ceasefire that America and Iran has agreed to. I want us to get some reaction, and we'll start with reaction from the US. I had a conversation this morning before we started the show, pre-recorded it because it was early hours in America. I spoke to David Smith, who is the bureau chief in Washington, D.C. for The Guardian newspaper, to give us some perspectives on how America is responding. Americans themselves, the Democrats, Republicans, and how everybody else is responding to this ceasefire that's been agreed to between America and Iran. Here's how that conversation went. David, thank you so much for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning.
So we moved yesterday from Donald Trump threatening to wipe out a whole civilization last night if Iran doesn't open that Strait of Hormuz, to now waking up here in South Africa to the news that there is a ceasefire of sorts and an agreement to pause on the attacks until negotiations continue in 2 weeks. What's been the reaction in America?
I think there's a huge sense of relief because for some time there, many people really feared this was the start of something quite apocalyptic, judging by Donald Trump's very dire threats. And there was great concern just how far would he go here? And you actually even saw some Democrats calling for Trump's removal from office and questioning his mental health. But there's still a great deal of skepticism about Trump's handling of this war, and a feeling that he may have been outmaneuvered by Iran strategically, diplomatically, politically, militarily, and so on. And some of those critics, for example, saying that under this ceasefire, Iran is effectively going to control the Strait of Hormuz, and in many ways that actually gives it more control than it had 2 months ago before this war even began. There are still Democrats saying Trump's conduct in the last 24 hours is cause for him to lose his job.
Yeah. And before we look at possibly what's likely to be under negotiations over the next 2 weeks, you mentioned that there are some critics of Trump who are saying he's been outmaneuvered here by Iran, strategically speaking. And I mean, it's very difficult to disagree with that, because when you look at the strategy of the US for this war, it looks like they've handed a weapon to Iran that is even more usable than a nuclear weapon. So that Strait of Hormuz that chokes up the global oil supply and disrupts the global economy is now something that Iran uses as power. So what's interesting to me, David, is the US strategy in the beginning was nuclear weapon. We don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But it looks like the war has now shifted to you have to open the Strait of Hormuz.
That's right. There's been a lot of shifting objectives and targets. Remember, right at the beginning, Donald Trump talked about the Iranian people rising up and overthrowing the regime, and we've heard less of that in recent weeks. The US is still claiming there has been a regime of change of sorts because numerous leaders have been killed. But nevertheless, in fact, the same regime stays in place. And of course, while the Ayatollah was killed, his son took over. And many would argue, actually, the Iranian leadership is more radical than it was. So that goal was not met. I'm sure the White House will claim it has set back Iran's ability to obtain a nuclear weapon, which was the starting point for this and meant to be the main reason. Again, that's hard to demonstrate. And I think there will be some who argue Iran is still capable of pursuing that in the coming years, and those critics will wish the US and Iran had just stuck to the nuclear deal negotiated by Barack Obama. And then, yes, on top of all of that, the Strait of Hormuz seems to be more, not less, under Iran's control than it was previously, which again is a bit of an own goal for the US. Will Iran's ability to sponsor terrorist groups in the region have been curtailed? Again, I think the jury's out on that. Not a great deal of evidence that's been achieved. And meanwhile, in the midst of all this, the whole war has been a massive blow to America's reputation around the world.
Yeah. It's really quite extraordinary because even with the Strait of Hormuz, for 47 years of tensions between the US and Iran, I mean, it's never really been closed, even though the tensions have existed between the two countries. Because America always pushed for the freedom of navigation has always been important to America. And now Iran knows just how powerful that Strait of Hormuz is in negotiating. So here's a question now, David. What do we understand about the relationship the US president has with Pakistan? Because it seems like they're the ones that were able to get to him. They suggested, please extend the deadline. Let's allow for 2 weeks of negotiations. And who knows? Some people are suggesting it's the US who went to Pakistan and asked them, please come out and ask for an extension, because Donald Trump knows that had he really continued with his threat to wipe out an entire civilization, that was going to have some incredible consequences.
To your point, if you just look at the Truth Social post by Trump on Sunday, railing about the Strait of Hormuz and using foul language, it did feel like someone who's losing control and lashing out. Hard to know exactly how and why Pakistan became such a central player in this. We certainly know that Trump had a fairly close relationship with Pakistan over the past year, and Trump claimed credit for averting a war between India and Pakistan, one of his long list of wars he likes to say he stopped happening. And I remember at that time Pakistani officials lavishing praise on Trump. And clearly they rose to the challenge here and have played an important role. Hard to know whether the US prompted that. Now Pakistan is saying they've invited the US and Iranian delegations for talks in Islamabad on Friday. I noticed the US already pouring some doubt on whether that's going to happen. But it was some welcome mediation at a moment when this whole thing really seemed to be spiraling out of control.
Yeah, and the US president said in that social media post that, and I quote here, "We've already met and exceeded all military objectives." What are those objectives according to the US? Because, I mean, I thought the objective was, one, clearly regime change, which Israel wanted so badly with the support of America. But two, America was more concerned about, is Iran an attack? I mean, is Iran a threat to America through its, possible nuclear weapon or enrichment? So when the U.S. president says we've exceeded all military objectives, what does this mean? Because as you said, no evidence yet of some kind of regime change the U.S. wanted. But also, two, have they obliterated their entire nuclear infrastructure?
Well, that's a great question. Because, and again, it's so hard to know who to trust. Of course, last year, the US launched military strikes and claimed Iran's nuclear capability had been obliterated. And yet, months later, they launched an entire new war over it. I'm sure the White House is going to say Iran has been set back tremendously on its ability to enrich uranium and pursue nuclear weapons. But hard to take anything they say without some pinch of salt. They will also say the Iranian military has been devastated, and the US gained full control of the skies, but there have been reports of Iran's ability to quite quickly dig out missile launchers from the rubble and pursue fresh strikes. And throughout this war, we've seen Iran still firing missiles into Israel and other countries in the region. And of course, just last week, after we've been told that the US controls the skies completely, a US fighter jet was actually shot down. And of course, there had to be a dramatic rescue of its crew. So there have been several incidents that suggest the US underestimated Iran's capability here militarily, and that might still include the nuclear aspect.
Yeah, I mean, they underestimated them strategically as well. The fact that the US president was not warned about the possibility of that Strait of Hormuz being weaponized, I mean, that really speaks volume about the intelligence that's been getting to him, or lack thereof. Let's talk now about this 10-point versus the 15-point plan, because Iran says we've presented a 10-point plan. The US president says we've got a 15-point plan. In fact, in his social media post, President Trump said this 10-point plan from Iran, he believes that it is a workable basis on which to negotiate. But when I was listening to the Iranian foreign minister talking about what is included in that 10-point plan, and I just wonder if it's going to be practical to America. They want America to understand that they will continue with enrichment. They want America to understand they will continue to have total control of the Strait of Hormuz. And I just wonder what that will mean on the American side. Is it even practical what Iran is asking for? And do we know what's in Trump's 15-point plan?
Yeah, I mean, these are all great questions. I think the Strait of Hormuz, it almost seems to depend on Trump's mood, because, of course, he's gone back and forth on that issue. There were moments last week when he was saying, we've done the hard work. Western allies, other countries should go to the Strait of Hormuz and just take the oil, and just get out as if he was washing his hands of the matter, and arguing that the US has such energy independence these days. It doesn't need the Strait of Hormuz itself so much. Other countries are affected. That raises the prospect, I think, that he might just get bored of this issue. And we shall have to see. Notably, that Iranian 10-point plan includes US military withdrawal from the Middle East.
From the Middle East? I mean, how do you think that is something that Trump would find acceptable? I mean, that would mean the US military, they must leave what? Even Qatar, one of the biggest military bases they have in the Middle East. And what would that mean then for America? And what would it also mean for the security of Israel?
Indeed, yeah, I think utterly unrealistic and not going to happen. Even though, of course, again, there are moments when Trump plays the isolationist and talks about bringing troops home, but as a practical reality, that is unthinkable. It appears to be an Iranian wish list, a maximalist approach. I don't think they're going to get all of those points by any means. And I guess this is what the future negotiation is going to have to be. I mean, ultimately, both countries are, of course, eager to claim victory, especially for their own domestic audiences. We're already seeing a flavour of that on both sides. Celebrations in Tehran, bold statements from the White House about what a triumph this is for Trump's diplomacy. And I think, what we know about Trump is that he will quickly move on to the next issue. He will leave negotiations to others. He will just deal in the headlines of what he claims is a great victory, and that will be that.
Mm-hmm. What are Americans saying? The last time we spoke to you, you told us that the polls, various polls in the US that were being done, were showing that most citizens don't know why this war is happening. They were not in support of this war. And in fact, I remember when, in the past, when America went into Iran and they asked Americans how they feel about the war, I mean, it was like 80% or 70% or so of support, even when the US went to Iraq. But that support has dramatically shifted and gone down now with America going into Iran. Are the polls still consistent? Are U.S. citizens still expressing their unhappiness with the U.S. going into war with Iran?
Yes, this war remains very unpopular. I think both for ethical reasons, what it means for America internationally and the fate of the Iranian people, but also very pragmatic domestic reasons of people see it driving up the price of fuel for their cars and the cost of fertilizer for farmers and other products just having a negative impact on the economy. I think millions of people who voted against Trump in the last election are horrified by this war and very much opposed to it. Obviously, on Trump's own side, among the Republicans, it's more complicated. They're, I think, older voters, especially including those who have long been hostile to Iran. They're broadly supportive of this, and it's notable. Those, for example, who watch Rupert Murdoch's Fox News are being told night after night that this is a very important idea, and there's lots of backing there for Trump and what he's doing. But there are, even on the right, there are younger voters. They might have backed Trump, but they thought he would be an isolationist, keep them out of foreign wars. There's the kind of wild rumors among younger men about a military draft. So it's unpopular with them, and that's reflected with some of the right-wing influencers such as Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly, who've been speaking out against this war, and some of them even joining the anxieties regarding Trump's mental health right now.
Yeah. David Smith, thank you so much for joining us. He is the Washington bureau chief for the Guardian newspaper. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that is the reaction we got from America, speaking to David Smith, who is live to us from Washington, D.C., in America. And I thought we should just get some analysis of these movements that we have seen over the last 24 hours.
Your voice.
Your questions.
Your morning radio with Clement Manyathela.
This is 702.
Hey, it's 24 minutes now before 11 o'clock. We continue our coverage of the developing story coming out of the Middle East, this ceasefire that has been agreed to by both Iran and the United States. So over the next 2 weeks, there won't be attacks on Iran by the US. Iran has also said we also will stop our defensive attacks. And in these 2 weeks, we're going to see the Strait of Hormuz opened. But that is going to be coordinated. Any movement there is going to be coordinated by Iran's armed forces. So we had a conversation in the previous half hour with David Smith, who was live to us from America in Washington, D.C. He's the editor or the bureau chief of the Guardian newspaper in Washington, D.C. And he was telling us how Americans are responding to this latest developments and helping us understand where the Trump administration's thinking is at, not just now, but also with all the different threats and the different deadlines that President Trump issued and missed and moved over the last couple of days. What I want us to do now is to understand what international law says, because there's been a lot of debate about intent. So if you are saying and threatening to wipe out an entire civilization, what does the Geneva Convention actually say? Does it matter that it's just a threat and you haven't followed through on it? And what happens when you follow through on it? We've invited Professor Hennie Strydom, who is the professor of international law at the University of Johannesburg, to help us understand international law much better in the context of what's happening in Iran. Prof, thank you so much. Always great to chat to you. Good morning.
Yeah, good day and good morning to the listeners.
So I want to start with perhaps the Geneva Convention and what it actually says, because often we hear about deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure and how that is considered a war crime. There must be that doctrine of proportionality. How does it work? Like when it comes to even the laws of wars, what's allowed and what's not allowed?
Yeah, one of the fundamental principles is the principle of distinction, meaning that in terms of in times of an armed conflict, the parties to that conflict must adhere to that principle, meaning that they cannot attack civilians themselves or civilian objects. So they have to maintain a distinction: what is a military object and what is not a military object. The problem is that some civilian objects may be sort of dual use objects. Let me give you an example. If there is a strategic bridge over a river, it is used for civilian traffic, but it is also used to transport military equipment, soldiers, etc. So the moment that usually civilian object is used also for military purpose, it may be attacked. So this is the one thing that we have to keep in mind. But if the evidence is that it's purely a civilian object, and its destruction will then, lead to a war crime being committed.
I see. So if it's a civilian infrastructure and it is used during the war, and let's say, for instance, because in Gaza, for instance, at some point Israel was claiming that Hamas was operating from certain hospitals. So is that then justification, if there's evidence to that effect, to then attack that infrastructure, even though it's a civilian infrastructure?
Yeah, you're quite correct with the example that you're using. So that is why you cannot use civilians as a shield or civilian objects as a shield to escape an attack or prevent you being a target. So that in itself is a war crime, to use civilian objects or civilians as a shield. So, and the moment that takes place, then that facility may be attacked because the military objective or the people that soldiers you're targeting are there on that spot and in that space, and makes it possible to attack them.
Is there any onus on the attacker to prove that, in fact, humans were used as a shield, or, for instance, that a public hospital or whatever civilian infrastructure was used in the war? Or is it a matter of, as a country, if you are the one fighting and you believe that the group or a government you are fighting is using civilian infrastructure to fight back or to attack you, then that's enough. There not need to be like some kind of evidence to that effect.
I believe that it is taking place, or speculation, certainly not enough. There's an obligation to make an assessment of the target, where it is, who is there, and does it constitute a military target. So that must be based on hard evidence, on factual evidence. And it's part of the assessment of any military strategy, and especially when you are sort of bombing places, sending missiles, etc. And it's only that there is sufficient or reasonable evidence that is the case that you can attack. But there's another principle that comes into play then. That's the principle of proportionality. If the damage that you cause is disproportional to the military objective, then it may also constitute a war crime. So, for instance, in the examples that you used, there are a serious number of civilians killed in it, disproportionate to the military target that you are aiming to wipe out. Then, depending on the facts, that may even, in those circumstances, constitute a war crime.
Okay, so in that case then, my question is about consequence management. So if we have seen international law being violated by Israel in Gaza, what are the consequences then for that? Because it almost feels like there are loopholes here. Anyone can always claim that, well, I targeted those civilians because amongst them were these terrorists, as they have said before. And that's why we had to even target a civilian infrastructure, because we know that they were operating there. But when you ask for evidence, it's not always that evidence gets presented. So my question is, what are the consequences then if countries violate international law?
Yeah, what actually should take place in those circumstances, there should be a proper investigation. For instance, by the International Criminal Court, to get the evidence to decide we have a case here of a war crime being committed or not. And that assessment by the court can only, or by the prosecutor, can only be made when there is concrete evidence to that effect. So we have judiciaries and bodies like that who then have the obligation to investigate. And there's also an obligation under the Geneva Conventions, where there's a reasonable evidence available that a war crime has been committed, that it must be investigated by the parties and bring those accountable to justice.
So how powerful are those institutions, though, Prof? Because, I mean, as you have seen, we are now talking about what's happened in Gaza, and yet there's still not been any accountability whatsoever. The ICJ case is still ongoing. Hopefully that leads to some level of accountability. But even when you look at the ICC, for instance, a warrant of arrest on Netanyahu, but America as well, they're not a signatory to the Rome Statute. So what happens then if they continue to do as they please or violate international law? Is the ICJ then what becomes an institution? And how powerful and influential is it? Because it almost feels like Israel and America are not even swayed by that court. They don't think it's powerful enough to make them do anything they don't want to do.
Yeah, you see, the courts, as you mentioned, do not have the power to enforce. They depend on enforcement by the members of the court, of their own statute, for instance, in the case of the ICC. So that is the enforcement mechanism that there should be. For instance, to execute a warrant of arrest and commence proceedings in any country under the domestic law of that country if the courts have jurisdiction. So that's one way. It's not necessarily the case that it should be done by the ICC. But then it depends on whether the country willing and able to do it have the mechanism and the political will to do so. So if we take all these instances that you mentioned into account, it's clearly whether we link in this whole criminal justice concept that we have, and that is the enforcement issue. If you do not have the support of the other countries being members of that constitutive instrument, then you have a problem. The court is then in a very sort of precarious position.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a case here in South Africa with the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, who had a warrant of arrest issued against him, and he still was allowed to set foot here, and we let him escape. Thank goodness to our courts, who have since come out and criticized government's position there. I want you to help us understand intent now, because often we hear of, this is a war crime, and it was deliberate and committed with intent. What does that mean? Whether it's intent to commit a war crime, intent to commit genocide? Because a lot of people are pointing to Trump's tweets and are saying, look what he has done. He says, I want to wipe out an entire civilization. If he follows through with the attacks, would that constitute intent?
In that example that you gave, certainly, because there was first a threat to do it, and giving evidence of the preparedness to wipe out the whole society. And if he follows through on that, it's a clear case of intent, of direct intent, because there is no indication that he has the objective to make a distinction between military and civilian targets. It's just a sort of blanket use of violence to wipe out a whole society or the civilians in the country included. So that will be very helpful for the court to determine direct intent, because that is one of the elements that you have to prove in the case of genocide under the Genocide Convention. So it is not something that happens as collateral damage. It must be clear that your intention was to wipe out that community or parts thereof.
Really, really, really fascinating stuff. Prof, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Hennie Strydom is the Professor of International Law at the University of Johannesburg.
From the townships to the suburbs and everywhere in between. It's the 702 MTN Small Business Awards. Enter now on Prime Media Plus. Let's talk shop.
It's 10 minutes now before 11 o'clock. Let's bring in Professor Christopher Isike, who is a professor of politics and international relations, now to reflect on, we now understand international law and how far it goes, but do we actually understand the positions that the two countries have put forward here? And what is the likelihood that we are likely to see a kind of a peace deal at the end of these negotiations after 2 weeks? Professor Isike, thank you for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning, Clement, and thank you for having me.
So let's start with the demands that have been put on the table by both these countries, Iran and America. When I first looked at them early this morning, I thought, I don't see America agreeing to Iran's demands. And equally so, I don't see Iran agreeing to America's demands. And just to refresh the memory of our listeners, or some that may not have heard me explain what the demands are, reports in America indicate that Trump's 15-point plan includes dismantling of Iranian nuclear facilities, a permanent ban on nuclear development, the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, limitations on ballistic missiles, and Iran on the other side. They've got a 10-point plan, and that includes the withdrawal of the U.S. forces from the Gulf region, continued control of the Strait of Hormuz, the cessation of war on all fronts, including in Lebanon, the acceptance of Iran's uranium enrichment program, and, of course, the lifting of all sanctions against Iran. When you listen to that, Professor Isike, is it realistic from both ends?
Well, both of them are actually maximalists in what their expectations are. But I think there are, for us to have this ceasefire that we're seeing, there had to be some kind of convergences, even if temporary. And one of those convergences would be about the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has shown capability to do, even if it's for a short while, right? So that's a convergence, and that's big for the United States right now. I'm sure they can then talk their way through. So despite the differences we see in them, both plans reveal some areas of overlap, particularly in terms of economic development, national security, and then the emphasis on cultural, identity.
What do you think of? Because some experts are describing this as like a fragile ceasefire. It's a term we often hear a lot. What do you think, though, having seen how the two countries have communicated with each other? I mean, there has been loss of trust because previously when negotiations were underway, attacks suddenly continued without warning. Do you think that this time around the dynamics are different and they call for both parties to take seriously this conversation, because both of them can see that they will suffer consequences if these attacks continue?
Absolutely, and that's the incentive for both of them to have these discussions now. The political trust question is very important. America seems to have lost that trust because of the dodginess, acting in bad faith when you are talking with someone and then, meanwhile you're planning to bomb them. So it meant that irrespective of what the discussions were, your decision was already made, right? So that's a big factor. But like you said again, the realization on both sides, especially on the American side, that Iran can hurt America's interest, not just in the region, but even directly if you look at how Americans are receiving the war at home and what that means for Trump's standing in the politics of the country. That's an incentive. But the assessment of the current ceasefire as fragile is correct. It is fragile and it is very transactional and conditional on the Strait of Hormuz remaining open. The fragility is in the fact that, one, we also have another bad faith interlocutor here, which is Israel, whose interest in the ceasefire is cannot be guaranteed. To serve their interest more, I would say Netanyahu's interest more to continue the war, because that will keep him politically relevant. And of course, he has the greater Israel plan, which he has been hoping to achieve by destabilizing the region, fragmenting it in order to emerge the strongest, right? So all of these things mean that if Israel, for example, was to continue to bomb Lebanon, Iran may be forced to respond in some form, and that can take us back to square one. So continuous strikes in other theaters and that lingering point of mistrust means that escalation remains, high, and any incident of any sort, could quickly collapse the arrangement, unless Mr. Trump is able to exercise agency like he did in the last attack in June last year, and call Netanyahu to order.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking now, because I remember exactly that moment when he was so frustrated, the U.S. president, and even used the F word. Well, he's been using those a lot of late. But the real issue back then was that there was discussions that were taking place, and then here you have Israel continuing to attack. So how do you then keep Israel in check this time around? Because as you say, in fact, I did see even some reports when I woke up this morning on CNN that just as this ceasefire was announced, there were still missiles that were being exchanged between Iran and Israel. So if Iran has made this commitment on paper that for 2 weeks we stop the attacks, we open the Strait of Hormuz, I haven't seen any commitment that Israel makes. And I wonder if that becomes important, given that should they continue with attacks, then Iran may walk away from the negotiations.
Yeah, look, it's also correct that those exchanges of fire we saw was because of the communication, gap between when the ceasefire was announced as something that was immediate effect and some of those, exchange that had already been set in motion. So when you fire a missile, for example, you can't call it back if it is done just a few minutes, even seconds sometimes before the announcement. So that's possibly an explanatory factor for that. But again, Israel has shown its disregard for peace agreements or ceasefires. We've seen that in the Lebanon case. We've seen that in the Gaza case, where they can decide on the whim to simply break the ceasefire and nothing happens. And like you said, this frustrated Mr. Trump the last time out. And look, the easiest way for him to do this is to withdraw or threaten to withdraw, because he's very good at threatening, to withdraw the support that America gives to Israel. America essentially funds Israel's military. The military aggression we see from Israel is largely funded by the United States. And also, of course, the political protection that they give it at the UN Security Council. So if America really is serious about wanting to rein Israel in, they could. There are other factors that can limit that. The impact of the APAC in the U.S. in terms of internal politics, and of course there has been talk about corruption, the Epstein files, and Israel, Netanyahu having a hold on Mr. Trump that could have made him to take this kind of decision without listening to his own intelligence chiefs, including the Pentagon, right? So there are a number of factors at play, but given his ego and what this would mean for his presidency, and his preference for wanting to be known as a peace president who would not go to war, which is all now been failed. I think that he wants to salvage himself somewhat from all of this and exercise some agency, and it is possible. If the
Professor, Professor Christopher Isike, thank you for making time for us. He's the Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Pretoria.